Welcome to the Cyber Insights Podcast, brought to you by the Greater Washington, D.C. chapter of ISACA. I'm your host, Jim Wiggins, joined today by my co-host, Mr. Altan Bulut. Our guest today is Mr. Jermaine Stanley, and we'll be discussing with him cybersecurity leadership, driving strategic growth. Let's get into the episode. Today's topic is cybersecurity leadership, driving strategic growth. Strong cybersecurity leadership is not just about protecting systems, it's about making strategic decisions that drive business forward. Whether it's workforce strategy, leadership development, or aligning security with business goals, effective cybersecurity leadership is key to staying competitive. Our guest today is Mr. Jermaine Stanley, a cybersecurity and IT risk advisory leader with over 25 years of experience across financial services, technology, government, and nonprofit sectors. He serves as a board member, recently serving as the president of the ISACA Greater Washington, D.C. chapter, and serves on the ISACA Foundation board. Jermaine is widely respected for his expertise in IT audit, risk advisory, and helping organizations build leadership teams that drive growth and innovation. Jermaine, welcome to the show.
Hey, Jim, thank you for having me. And thanks, Alton, for also having me as well. I'm excited about today's show.
I'm very excited as well.
How are you doing
Yep,
today,
thanks
by
for
the way,
having
Alton? I
me.
didn't get a
Yeah,
chance to say hi to you.
I'm doing great. I'm doing so well, and super excited to have Jermaine on here. And then just there's so many things to talk about.
Yep, absolutely. So let's get into it. So, hey, Jermaine, I thought maybe we could, talk a little bit about your background. I know you've had an impressive career working across multiple industries in cybersecurity, IT risk, and leadership. Can you share your journey and what led you to focus on leadership development within cyber?
Well, that's great. So, yeah, I didn't start off in the risk advisory space, Jim. It was more or less Sarbanes-Oxley's fault back in the early days. I kind of stumbled into it. And I said, this is interesting. Controls and policies and procedures and things like that. So let me get into that. And, eventually over the years, I worked with some of the larger accounting consulting firms in the world. And that eventually shifted to focus on data security before we started really calling it cybersecurity, if you remember. And, during that whole journey, I had some very great leaders that I took a little bit from all of them, each of them to help with my style. And then there's some that just did not jive with me. So, I said, okay, I don't want to be like them. And me being someone who's, a black Latino, right, a black Puerto Rican, I stood out, right, in a lot of situations way back in my early career. And, it made me think about, as I fast forwarded into where we are today, it got me to thinking over time that, you need a voice, you need sponsorship, you need people to help you move things. You need people that you can emulate, that you can see doing things that can relate to you or you can relate to them. So when it comes down to the leadership part of it, it is how do we help those next generation of leaders, no matter who you are, succeed and actually paving the way for them to be successful so they don't have some of the challenges that I faced. And I'm only speaking on my personal experience, but I'm sure others have had similar experiences. But if we were to talk about that journey, that would probably sum it up for me, Jim.
Understood. Hey, so I know you're talking about how companies are shifting in their thinking about leadership. How have you seen this change play out in cybersecurity, specifically in the cyber sector? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about this later, but we're in some very interesting times, as you know. Prior to the new administration, we were challenged with a lot of cybersecurity just issues, just things that all companies were dealing with, and the rapid pace in which it happened. And then if you add the advent of AI and how you can emulate actual people's voices to call into a department and say, hey, release certain funds to a certain account, that gets a little scary. So you layer now what's happening on top of that with all the changes, the recent changes. There is a shift, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as well. And that's around the resiliency, building secure teams, right? We'll put on our cybersecurity risk advisory hat. You got to look at it from that perspective. And companies are shifting towards making sure that they have the type of leadership that is resilient through these changes. And as we can all know that what's happening now with the different executive orders that are coming in and out, a lot of folks don't know what to do, or some folks are really battening down the hatches, so to speak. But that shift is happening, and companies who are good at building those resilient teams or already have those resilient teams in place from a leadership perspective, they're going to do fine. They're going to weather the storm, so to speak, Jim.
So, with all that being said, it sounds like you're kind of indicating that companies aren't necessarily moving away from leadership investments. What we have historically thought of is programs, maybe like DEI, if we could use that term. They're just being
Right.
more strategic about it. So, what does that look like in cyber?
Well, and from the standpoint of cyber, it boils down to um, not only the resiliency, but the agility. So within cybersecurity, as you know, we're constantly moving, we're constantly evolving. So agility comes into mind. You have to be able to adapt to the changes. So I don't think it's much more different than some of the other industries, but probably a little bit different because we are constantly moving. But all companies are feeling this. Well, let me be a little more clear. All industries are feeling this, right? So you have to have that adaptability. The other thing that comes to mind is, and you're going to hear a lot more about this, uh, throughout the year, and that is this whole thing around emotional intelligence. You probably remember that part, or the EQ. And then you have the CQ, which is the cultural intelligence, right? So, although we may not be calling it DEI anymore, a lot of companies are shifting into embedding a lot of these things within the fabric of what they do. And the work is still there to be done because at the end of the day, it's all about the well-being of the people in your organization. So, cybersecurity, like other industries, are filling this and they're making the adjustments as they go. And again, it goes back to that strong leadership, that resilient leadership, that secure leadership that I mentioned previously.
So let's kind of build on that. Let's talk about what cybersecurity leadership really means today. You brought up that as a concept, and it's obviously a part of the title of our show today. We know that it's not just about managing risk, it's about building strong and resilient teams, aligning security with business objectives, and making sure that security leaders have a seat at the table. From your experience, what are the most important qualities of a modern cybersecurity leader? Any thoughts?
Yeah, so I'll go, I know this is like a rinse and repeat. We're engineers, so we kind of think that way, right? So the adaptability during the times of turmoil, during the times of constant change, to be able to pivot, right? And one thing that we can go back to, some of the silver lining of the years of COVID and the pandemic, we had to pivot quickly. And I believe the cybersecurity industry, like the risk advisor industry, we pivoted pretty well to make sure that the people who were doing the work had the support they needed, right? So, again, going back to the adaptability, going back to the emotional intelligence that you have as a leader, and that cultural intelligence as well, that companies will need in regards to their leadership. And how do you do that? You can go through resilience training, right? You can provide coaching, the communication skills to really dive a little bit more deeper into those things that you probably were doing before, but nowadays you wouldn't be surprised to hear companies either doubling down on what they're doing internally with regards to their well-being efforts to make sure that folks who otherwise may not have had the opportunity, their voices are all being heard. And the other thing about this, when you make this shift into what I was just saying, well-being of your company, your people. This is everybody, Jim, not just a certain demographic that we're talking about here. All companies are going through this and they're trying to figure out the best way in which they can support all of its employees. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think Alton wanted to bring up an
I just
idea or
yeah, I
thought.
also want to
Go ahead, Alton.
follow up on that in terms of when we want to embed maybe the processes that organizations can have in their like workflows that to make sure that their leadership development programs have that resilience built in a sustainable way and perhaps in a more measurable way. Have you seen more successful strategies or approaches than others in terms of maintaining that level of operational effectiveness when it comes to making
Yeah,
sure that like things actually stick and then changes are measurable in a way that you can tell either maybe through a mechanism of feedback, maybe you have your 360 feedback or something like that to
yeah,
be able to keep track of like are people bouncing back, is there like a circular pattern or are things actually improving or staying in an improved way over the long term perhaps? What are your thoughts on that?
yeah. That's a great question. I would say, Alton, that it's early in the game right now,
Mm,
and it's probably within the next 3 months, maybe you might
mm,
start to see some of the numbers come out. So it's companies are going through this process of realigning what they do. That's what
mm-hmm,
I was describing earlier, right? A lot of companies are going through this realignment, so it's going to need some time to kind of bake in
mm,
a little bit and to see how these things are happening, and how they're helping the various people within these organizations. Okay. I think that, of course, you got to do the pulse surveys, you got to do the employee engagement kind of thing.
mm-hmm,
You got to see how people, what are they actually doing? How
mm-hmm,
are they feeling about this, right? So that voice of the
mm-hmm,
employee comes into play. A lot of companies are going to really be using that to make sure that they're, getting the insights that they need from their employees, right? Because otherwise you won't know where you are. So what this is doing is helping organizational leaders uh, with those blind spots, so to speak, right?
mm-hmm,
So you got to do those things where you're still engaging with your employees. But I would go back to your original point or question, and that is, it's still a little too early for me, at least, to pin that. I would
mm-hmm.
say let's give it a few more months to see where it goes. But yeah, but it's a great question though.
Yeah. Maybe we can look at it in a broader perspective when we think about the cultural intelligence and how it ties to the emotional intelligence. Have you observed maybe successful implementations of that? Maybe tying the outcomes to the changes that are introduced, making sure that people have the right incentives, maybe to maintain improved processes or the governance structures, perhaps, to make sure that they recognize the benefit and value that is generated from that in a more clear and palpable way, if it makes sense. I mean, just like overall, it's not necessarily tied to a specific type of change, but
Mhm.
when things are abstract and we're trying to make sure that some principles actually are uh, acknowledged at a deep level in people's consciousness and then understanding. So how do we make sure that in the real world people like don't like unthinkingly behave in ways that they're used to and then they can tie back to their day-to-day habits, perhaps like this is impacting me and then people around me in certain ways.
Mhm.
And then just is there any tools, maybe conceptual tools that you found useful that helps people in their day-to-day
Right.
lives or maybe
Yeah, I'm
like
sorry to
interactions with
interrupt you, but yes.
yeah.
So, I'll go back to the cultural health and adaptability that I mentioned. I touched on a little bit, and what you're describing is, and making sure that I'm tracking.
Mm,
What you're describing is that this means that organizations are making, a conscious effort to to determine how well their culture supports adaptability and resilience. And, again, during these uncertain times. So I look at that as a superpower, so to speak, if you want to call it that. And again, I'll go back to what I said earlier in regards to leaders being able to dig in, because that shift did happen in regards to, companies, moving away from those traditional metrics that they're tracking, right? So they're looking more towards the sentiment metrics versus, are we complying with diverse hires? Are we complying with this or that? So companies have to be very deliberate these days in regards to how they do that and how they address those things. You touched a little bit on the emotional intelligence and the cultural intelligence. That comes through training. And there are experts out there in the world, as you know, that can come in and help organizations up their game, so to speak, in regards to whether it's emotional intelligence or cultural intelligence. There are opportunities for organizations to be valuable resources, or those external consultants to be valuable resources to organizations to, to cover that, to help their employees, to help their situations. But again, as you're seeing, a lot of companies are just riding the wave right now. They're just like, okay, what's coming next? How do we figure this out? And I say time will tell. Like I said, 2 or 3 months down the road, maybe a little longer, you'll start to see some of those changes, or you start to at least start to see some of the results of the changes or the adjustments that companies are making today.
Hey, Jermaine, I wanted to ask you a question. I know, based on everything you were talking about with regard to the executive orders and the new administration, a lot of companies are kind of hesitant right now. There might be freezing hiring, maybe scaling back on, obviously, different training programs. Leadership development might be impacted, and really just kind of waiting to see what happens next. Do you think that playing it safe like that is a big risk, or is that really kind of a recommended approach? Any thoughts? Can you expand or maybe elaborate on any of those ideas?
Yeah, yeah. Plan is safe. You will be left behind. It's just how I look at it. Because the work is still there, the work still needs to be done. You still have things to do. If you have customers to serve, and you still have to put mechanisms in place to help your teams, your people, be creative and continue the innovation, right? If you sit back and wait, you'll miss out on opportunities that may be there for you as a company. So that it's I know it's hard to to just see all of this happening. I know it's easy just to say, okay, we're going to take the stance that, okay, we're just going to wait to see what happens. But again, if you have that resiliency, that strong leadership, that strong, um, set of core values, you'll ride the wave. You'll be okay. But I think playing it safe probably is not a good idea at this point. I think you should understand, okay, we got to pivot. We have to make adjustments. We understand that. But we can't lose our identity along the way, as we try to meet the needs of our customers, meet the needs of of the people that we serve,
Yeah.
so to speak.
Yeah.
So
So playing
yeah,
it safe.
that's my
Yeah.
thought on that, Jim.
Yeah. I totally agree with you on that, Jermaine. I think playing it safe may not prove very safe after all. Like in the end,
Right.
it might be more dangerous if you look at the long-term impacts that you will probably incur, right? In terms of your organizational.
Yeah. And let me add a little bit more to that.
Yeah.
I mentioned innovation, right? You,
Yeah.
you can't be you're not being innovative if you're sitting back waiting. Well, we know just by the fact that we're in cyber, we're all in tech,
Yeah.
innovation doesn't wait for us.
Yeah.
And the top talent,
Yeah. Yeah.
the top talent doesn't wait for us, so
Exactly.
they go to where they feel welcome, where they know that they can make a difference and make an impact.
Exactly.
That's a great follow-up, Alton. I think I like that. Thank you.
So, I wanted to ask about, many cybersecurity leaders struggle with balancing security priorities with business objectives. From your background, what are some of the practical strategies for aligning cybersecurity with business? And then maybe how does that correlate back to what we've been talking about relative to our people?
Yeah. Looking at it from the standpoint of alignment, right? It's and the part of that shift of focusing on, say, certain demographics. The strategies now is, they're aligning what they're doing with the business objectives, right? To be successful in that regards and or to help with that success. So some of the strategies that, I would recommend, uh, when you talk about the security priorities with the business objectives is, what are you doing in regards to how you practice um, security within your company, right? How do you um, leverage technology to not be such a weaponized, or when I say technology, I'm talking about like AI, but just having those, understanding of what AI means and how it can impact the business, how it can benefit the business, how it can benefit the people that you serve. So being aware and having the intelligence around how we're going to leverage technology is another example of a strategy that I would also recommend that, companies who are really struggling with this haven't figured it out yet. And we know there are some companies out there who have figured out how to leverage technology like AI. I can give some examples of companies that I know that they have their own internal AI ecosystem where they have their policies and procedures. They perform audits of how to use the technology. And then, of course, we know what we're hearing in the world in regards to, uh, you know, frameworks and things of that nature. You have what's happening over in the UK or in Europe in regards to how they feel about AI. And I think the US is, trying to catch up in regards to its um, understanding of how to leverage that technology. But I believe if you pull back on that emotional intelligence piece, being smart about it, taking a risk-based approach in regards to how you leverage technology. That will help you not have to worry so much about not meeting your objectives, so to speak, because it supports what you're doing. It's in the ethos of the organization in regards to how they do those things.
So, with all that being said, can you expand a little bit about on the idea that people really, when we discuss alignment, how do people fit into all of that, right? I mean, we're talking here about leadership. We're talking about investing in our people. I mean, is that a component of this in your estimation? Like, do we need to not only think about where the business is headed, but ultimately how people fit into that equation? Does that make sense?
Absolutely, absolutely. You recall I said earlier, it's really about the well-being of your organization and the people that drive your mission every day, your strategies, your goals every day. If they're not feeling welcome, if they're not feeling like they have an opportunity to share their insights, if they're not feeling psychologically safe, right? If they don't, if it boils down to they just don't feel appreciated, you're not going to get them to perform at their optimal levels. And as we know, if you feel like those things are in place that I just mentioned, you're more likely to stay, right? So of course, yes, your people have to be paramount at the top of that list to make sure that their well-being is in place. And coming out of COVID, all the cybersecurity things that we're experiencing, all the issues that are happening in that space, AI, the advent of AI, a lot of things changing, a lot of things happening very rapidly. The new changes or the administrative changes down in our DC area and all the things that are happening with that, that's a lot for people to take on, whether you are in the office or whether you're remote. There's a lot of things that you have to deal with. And then if you have this weight on your back of, hey, I might lose my job because of changes in how things are being done or said, you're going to have a bunch of stressed out people. In some cases, you might have a bunch of disgruntled employees. So again, that has to be paramount. The people, as part of your alignment, your strategies, yes, they have to be at the top of that list.
I want to maybe like shift gears slightly here. Wonder your thoughts on, like, we hear about the potential benefits of AI and the like automation in a lot of places, especially when it comes to leadership too. I wonder what you think about the potential risks of that. Like, AI has the potential to obviously automate a lot of things, but
Yeah.
it can make people kind of cognitively lazy to a certain point. I don't know if it makes sense to. I mean, it can give the illusion of that you can abdicate your decision making responsibilities even at a very high level, and then because you're suggested some certain things, do you think it has the like risk of creating a void in people's decision making, like thought processes that might like create some gaps that might need to be adjusted or maybe like thought through in the shifts that we see? And then do you see any specific risks around that? Especially when we see like AI's potential to have a lot of like bias based on the training sets and training data that is fed into it to generate a lot of its predictions or inference based outputs. So I was wondering what you think of that, like how it might impact the overall trajectory of how things are getting shaped.
Yeah, so you're hitting on some things here, Alton. I could tell you this that I'm a big Star Wars fan. Okay.
Yeah, me too.
And if you follow Star Wars, there's always this thing about the light side and the dark side of the Force. In this case, AI is the Force. And when I give my keynote, I talk about AI's role in this. And you mentioned something about biases and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. So we know technology in general was to be put in place to help all of humankind, right?
Yeah.
And it helps us do things maybe quicker, faster, more efficient. But there's always a dark side or a not so bright side to it. And I think there could be some complacency if you're not aware, if you're not trained enough or understanding enough of how AI works, how it could be beneficial. But you also need to understand those things that could be a challenge. One can be, hey, I'll be very basic with this. I want AI to write me a letter
Mm-hmm.
to my organization. Here are some of the key points I want in there. And if you're not, if you don't take the time to, and this is very basic, I know, to edit that, you could just, look at it real quick. Okay, let me send it out, and it's probably chock full of things that probably are not appropriate,
Mm-hmm.
right, for your organization. So then you open up a can of worms there. So it goes back to what I was just saying about um, the being aware of how to leverage technology. I mentioned earlier that companies have their own internal ecosystems in regards to the 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 the, the shells and shell knots of AI, so to speak, right? Or leveraging these types of technology. But yes, I think there could be some complacency there if leaders aren't aware of this, which by that being in place, that the lack of understanding, that could possibly trickle down into your organization if you don't have that that perspective on, okay, we just need to make sure it's safe for that. And I know a lot of companies are really doing this, and we've been running with AI for a few years now. So a lot of companies have embraced the fact that it's not going anywhere. Let's see how it can benefit the business, but also let's make sure that the people who are going to be using it for the business on behalf of the business understands this is how you play safe. This is how you don't play safe. This is how you stay on the light side of the force. Don't go onto the dark side of the force. Hope that helps all.
Yeah, totally. So, have you seen in terms of like the training or maybe building awareness, like how do you stay on that light side? How do you make sure that as a leader or maybe even a practitioner, like, is there any
Mhm.
reliable ways that you can that you have identified so far that prevents people, maybe helps people avoid having to compound maybe some cognitive biases with that amplification of AI, if it makes sense, because it has the potential, as you said, to amplify both the good and the bad, and then people's cognitive errors maybe that might need some awareness, like in terms of building a training strategy, for example. Like, how do you factor in like the existence of like ubiquitous AI usage into making sure
Yeah,
that people
so
realize, like maybe case
I'll take a couple
studies?
approaches to that.
Yeah.
So obviously the security awareness training
Mm-hmm.
piece. Understand, having that embedded as part of the annual training or semi-annual training, depending on how you do it in your organization. You want to make sure that there's, a content within your modules that show here's AI, here's how to effectively use it, here's what you can't use, here's what you can't put in to AI. Obviously proprietary information, you can't put that in there.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to make sure that there's content like that that says you shall or you shall not kind of thing. And I mentioned that before.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, the the other part around just awareness is if you have policies within the organization in regards to this is how we feel about AI or leveraging this technology. Here are the things that you can and cannot do. Here are the things that we recommend. I've also heard of organizations leveraging working groups internally where they just have a chat, maybe once or twice, maybe once every week or once every couple weeks. They get together, they just talk about the latest and greatest and what's happening within the realm of artificial intelligence and how it could have some implications internally. So being smart about that and not being so, not necessarily being a closed off system from the world, but also being able to bring into the conversation internally. Here are the latest trends. Here's how it's impacting our business. Here's how um, we can help our employees work faster, smarter, and safely. Right. So I've seen a little bit of those things as well, Alton.
Yeah.
So, hey, Jermaine, you were talking a lot about technology and artificial intelligence. I'm wondering, are you seeing any other emerging trends in technology and cybersecurity that are ultimately positioned to impact an organization's approach from a leadership and a strategy perspective? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, from an emerging perspective, it to me is going back to what I said earlier about the resiliency of your organization, and looking at it from a risk-based perspective. I think that those are some things are um, that are still important, and they're still emerging in my perspective. Now, I could be a little bit, you know, short-sighted on that, but that's just my thought on that.
And why
On
is
that,
that? Is that because of just the fact that they've got to be adaptable to the changes that are coming? Is that kind of what you're thinking, or I'm trying to figure out what you mean by that?
yes, yes,
I got it.
yes,
Okay.
exactly. Again, I mentioned that earlier about the adaptability. So we have to be adaptable in these, at certain times. There are a lot of changes with that. Um, everybody's overwhelmed with a lot of things that are happening. So digital transformation is always rapid, right? Trying to retain your top talent, and then also trying to mine those blind spots that I mentioned earlier, right, that leaders are facing. So these are some challenges or emerging things that it's not necessarily always a technological thing. It boils back down to the leadership part, or in this case, leadership misalignment could be an issue as well.
Understood. Understood. So, with all of that being said, are there areas that you think organizations should be focusing on in terms of their leadership efforts? You talked about adaptability, you talked about resilience. Are there any other, you talked about, emotional intelligence, you talked about cultural intelligence. There's a wide range of
Yes.
skill sets and all of that, right? If you had to
Yeah.
prioritize, what do you think? Is there kind of like a pecking order, or is there a if you don't have this, at least go do this, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So pulling on that thread I just said earlier about, leadership misalignment, um, those middle managers within your organization and upskilling them on this as well. I did mention leadership, and leadership, as you know, can be broad. And, I was initially speaking towards those who are actually making the decisions, who are actually at the top of the chain, so to speak. But you also have to feed your middle managers, and make sure that they have the know-how, the insights, the EQ, the CQ that I mentioned earlier around emotional intelligence and cultural intelligence. Because those folks, just like small businesses help run the economy or are the engine of the economy here, middle managers are those folks who have that direct connection with the upper management as well as the boots on the ground staff and others. So you got to make sure you're feeding them and making sure that they have those skills: resiliency, adaptability, strong leadership, EQ, CQ. And that's something that I'd see that at a minimum you should be, trying to do those as well.
So I remember reading books on emotional intelligence. Cultural intelligence is a relatively new idea. Can you spend a couple minutes and talk about what that is and whether there are some existing frameworks or some existing, ways an organization anchors to try to measure their own cultural intelligence?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what is it first off? I guess maybe that's the best way to.
So in a nutshell, cultural intelligence is more or less um, the ability to relate to other cultures, right? That's that's the that's the that's the biggest thing right there. Okay. And it helps you, lead multifaceted teams, high performing teams, right? Because it allows managers who lack that cultural intelligence, especially in the tech world, um, it helps them with things like how do we communicate?
Mm,
Very basic stuff, right?
got it. Got it.
Reducing friction in cross-functional projects, because again, by the nature, and I've said this in previous discussions that you and I've had and others that I've had with, you're diverse by nature of your business. We just are different people. So as you know, we work in this space very much. We are cross-functional. So it helps with reducing that friction. And if you have friction or if you have miscommunication, companies are going to lose out on the opportunities to innovate, right? We go back to that since we're technologists, right? So when you take that approach to teach people about what cultural intelligence is, um, it helps you embrace those diverse perspectives. It helps you align teams more efficiently, right? And so that helps accelerate innovation. It helps improve team collaboration. It helps increase employee engagement. And you, as an organization, you achieve your results faster because you've reduced inefficiencies caused by cultural misunderstanding. So that friction that I talked about earlier.
That makes
Hope that
sense.
helps.
That makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Hey, I did want to ask another question too. We were discussing the idea about business strategy and alignment and all these other kind of fun concepts that are important to organizations. Cyber, of course, is not really viewed any longer as purely a technical focus and a technical function. What is your advice, or what kind of advice would you give to leaders who want to ensure that security is integrated into their overall business strategy? Any particular kind of thoughts or approaches or methods or practices that you find to be particularly useful in trying to ensure that integration occurs between cyber and business? Any thoughts on
Mhm.
that?
Yeah, if you recall, I was talking earlier about that, right, in regards to having it built within how you do things within your organization. The people that we talked about, making sure that they have the things that they need so that they can be innovative, so they can be aware, so that they can pivot when they need to pivot. And with security in general, whether it's physical, whether it's cyber, it's ever changing. So adaptability comes back into play. Then that resiliency comes back into play, right? So yeah, I think I'll go back to that. I'll leave it at that. I think it's those things will help you make sure that you have um, that cohesiveness and that alignment with the objectives of the business, the goals of the business, as well as how security plays a role in that. And as we know, it all boils down to humans, human beings doing things that they shouldn't be doing. And we talk about risky activities, right? Whether it's internal, externally facing. And from an internal perspective, having that awareness, so the security and awareness comes back into to the fold because a good majority of the people in your organization, your company, your business are not the techies. They're everyday business people, men and women. So we need to arm them with the insights. And that's where we come in as professionals, as experts, right? To help them figure this stuff out, Joe.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, as you're talking and sharing some of this, your experience, one of the things that resonates with me is this idea that people a lot of times, unfortunately, are just kind of perceived as a resource, right? So whether it's downsizing or upsizing or whatever, there's this kind of idea that well, these people are kind of disposable, and I think what I'm hearing you kind of articulate is that people are kind of like that linchpin within the organization ultimately, right? Because they're the ones that provide the services and the operations and all those other types of things. And
Mhm.
they're a really really important commodity or a really important resource, but they shouldn't be necessarily treated as the same across all other resources. And I don't know
Yeah.
if you want to comment on that, but that was one of the things that was resonating to me because we always talk about like people, processes, and technologies. And in cyber, we like
Mhm.
to focus on processes and we like to focus heavily on the technology, but it's that people
Mhm.
component that a lot of times we tend to kind of neglect.
Mhm.
Any ideas? Any thoughts on that? Am I? You think I'm on the right track with that idea, or what are your thoughts?
150% with you there, Jim,
Okay.
on that one. I could tell you, you can't do anything as a business without your people. Let's stop right there. If you don't have the folks that are in place to execute the vision, the mission, you're gonna fail. You're just gonna falter as an organization. But if you're, as I said earlier, if you're feeding them the things that they need so that they can then now be their best selves as possible to go out and innovate, to go out and troubleshoot, right? Look for solutions to a challenge, right? If you don't have those things in place, your people won't have that ability to, flourish, right? You just don't flourish, and then your objectives are missed, and you start to wonder as a leader, what's going on? Okay, well, did you do those sentiment surveys, like pulse surveys or voice of the employee, to figure out how are we doing as leaders and how are we doing in supporting our people? So yes, absolutely agree with you there, Jim.
So, Jermaine, I want to ask you about the some of the metrics that we can look at. Do you have any like reliable trends that you keep tabs on in terms of like how things are shaping up, both in the industry or in a given enterprise, in terms of the leadership uh, trends improving versus like devolving, or like how do you make sense of the changes in terms of when trying to think about like compared to 6 months ago or 3 years ago? How are we doing right now in terms of what do you tend to prioritize from your point of view?
Yeah, great question there. So, metrics, I mentioned one earlier, and that was around the sentiment, right, in regards to how are we doing as a company. That's one metric that you should always, as an organization, keep an eye on is how are we doing. Um, I still, I know this is not a DEI kind of thing, or, conversation, but you got to look at how are we working with those small and medium-sized businesses, right? If you're looking at um, supplier diversity or suppliers in general, you want to keep an eye on that metric. You still want to keep an eye on certain metrics that, show that your organization is supporting its people, right? So think of it as how many events are we doing that supports the well-being of the entire organization? What type of well-being resources, have we provided to our particular to our to our people, right? And you can track those numbers. And if you have a learning management system or a platform that tracks the attendance, you can see those metrics, right? Or how many people have attended, how many people completed the course, and you could do that annually, and so year over year you're seeing things like that. And I'm going to stay on that side of the curve, and that is well-being type metrics will help you understand how well your organization feels about its direction, how people themselves feel about how their contributions to the organization, right? And that voice of the employee, which that's not a new concept, Alton. That's something that's been around for years. You understand how it goes. You understand how what we're doing at the leadership level, how we're being perceived matters, right? So
Mm.
we need to make adjustments as leaders along that route. Organizations make adjustments along that route to support those people. Again, going back to what I said about feeding them what they need.
Yeah. So, are you a fan of like surveys or trying to get a sentiment analysis from people, like in terms of their well-being or angst or uncertainty, and maybe how that ties to productivity or maybe cohesion in a given environment?
Yeah,
Have you seen that work like successfully or?
that's a good one too. So if I'm feeling the weight of the world on my shoulders, and I can't get a break with my supervisor, if I can't, get that opportunity to lead a project, I don't care who you are.
Mm.
I don't care who you are. No matter who you are in the company. Again, this is anybody. You're not going to be your best self.
Yeah.
You're just not. And you're not going to showcase those abilities. And the good leaders know how to bring that out. They know how to bring collaboration to the top of the conversation so that everyone has an opportunity. Everyone on the team has an opportunity, not just a certain class of person or demographic. Um,
There's
so
like
yes,
yeah.
that's how I feel about that, Alton.
There's like a constant risk of like people's capabilities being diminished, right? I mean, not being
Yep.
because of those like psychological forces that maybe underpin a lot of those things. And because I asked about the surveys, like I know that for example, economists are huge fans of like inflation expectations, like what you expect things to look like in a year or two can have actual impacts on how the world turns out to be. Because, for example, when people have high inflation expectations, they tend to like go out and on a shopping spree before prices rise, and then that ends up actually raising prices because of increased demand in the short run. So, if people have like, because of uncertainty, have some like angst or maybe some built up uh, psychological pressures, that might have like vicious cycle type of impacts too, right? Like self fulfilling maybe prophecies in the wrong direction. That's a lot of people, I feel like, aren't paying enough attention most of the time.
Hmm.
And maybe
Let's see.
just my thoughts on that, but
Yeah, I can agree with you on that. I mean, and there could be some parallels with that just in the, your work environment, right? You might be a little bit more cautious as an individual,
mm,
to maybe innovate. You may feel like, hey, I don't know if I'm gonna have a job tomorrow. Should I be looking for another job?
mm,
Should I look for so people are tending to be, try to gain some sense of security in regards to their position within a company,
mm,
right? But like I said earlier, we'll see in a few years, maybe a few months, how things are shaking out. But it doesn't look like anything's changing soon. And, for those folks who are in the federal sector, I feel for you, and it's a challenge, and we're rooting for you. We want to support you. And there are a lot of organizations that are trying to do things to uh, be a resource, an outreach, and I know that we are trying to do the same thing at ISACA Greater Washington D.C., looking at ways that we can support those who are impacted by the changes that are happening with regard to, just this whole work thing, right? So, yeah, I
Absolutely.
like your insight there, though, Alton.
yeah. Thank
Hey, Jermaine, I wanted to ask you a question. We're coming down to the hour, so we're almost done. But
Yeah,
if someone were to come to you, and let's say they didn't have a strong cybersecurity function deployed in their organization, in other words, maybe there wasn't much of a cybersecurity leadership component, what initial steps would you recommend that an organization might take generally if they wanted to ultimately start to build out and strengthen a cybersecurity leadership function or capability within their organization? Any thoughts on that?
yeah. You don't really run into those that often these days, do you, Jeff?
Well, what it was,
Um,
what is a startup company, right? Maybe you got a new
yeah,
organization. They've just
yeah,
opened their doors, and they're like, yeah, we're so focused on operations, we're so focused on shipping product that we haven't really thought much about cyber, and now we've got to start to,
yeah,
or maybe somebody wants to come and wants to improve. They want to mature their existing
yeah.
culture around cybersecurity. Any thoughts?
Yeah, yeah, good context on that. So if it's, a startup, there's a few things that come to mind right off the bat. You want to make sure you have somebody within your team or bring in someone within your team to be on your team that is that technologist that understands not only cybersecurity but IT. So maybe some kind of technology officer or something like that, you know. May not be that level, but someone who has a good grasp on that. The other thing I would do is also, as an organization, align yourself to a framework, right? And if you can align yourself to a framework, whether it's NIST, whether it's ISO, FAIR method, or whatever, those things will help you, stabilize, so to speak. Now, if you don't have the internal capacity for someone to do the job, you can hire someone to come in and help you do that. You can outsource that until you have a point where you can bring someone in full time to do those things. And then you scale as you grow, right? You grow it as you scale the business. If you're looking to enhance it, yeah, you might want to have someone come from the outside and do an assessment, do some kind of security assessment, whether it's ISO, which that looks ISO 27001, that looks like the entire organization, not just a certain thing. If you're a product company, um, looking at getting your product certified, like via SOC 2, right? Something like that, SOC 2 Type 2 audits. Or if you're looking to do business with the federal government, obviously there's FedRAMP that's out there, but there are a lot of experts, as you know, that are out there that can help you figure this out. So lots of resources for folks to go to if they really, really, um, needed to get something stood up or to improve what they do. There's a lot of companies, as you know, that do this, that can
Understood.
help companies do that.
Understood. Hey,
Yep.
one final question for you. What are some of the key skills, certifications, or leadership training programs that you think would be useful or beneficial for cybersecurity professionals to focus on or around?
Mhm. Yeah, I would say, I think ISACA recently, and ISACA is an organization that we're all near and dear to. Uh, I believe they just released some training or some white paper on auditing AI. I
Yes,
can't recall it. I
they
believe
did.
that might be the case.
Yep.
There's a
That's the one thing
beta
that I point
AI
to.
auditing
So
certification, I
what
believe.
what I'm really driving at is there are organizations like ISACA, ISC squared, ISSA that can help you figure out or get the training and insights on the different aspects of technology, of cyber, and how you go about either assessing it or implementing it the right way. There are a lot of sources out there. Another source that comes to mind is the National Cybersecurity Alliance as well. Um, they are the people that do staysafeonline.org. So they have different levels of content that is based on where you are. So let's say you're in high school, you want to learn about it. They have information for you. Let's say you are someone who just retired and want to try a new career. They have information on how you can go about breaking into cyber. Let's say you someone who just retired from the military. They have something for you there as well. Or I'm just coming out of college. They have different things that you can dive into. And lastly, I'll throw out there another resource is to check out the ISACA Foundation. The ISACA Foundation is helping individuals reskill into the cybersecurity and digital trust space, offering certifications as well. And last, I can't leave the show without saying this. Hey, take one of our training courses, ISACA Greater Washington, D.C. We have tons of them, so come check us out.
Awesome. Awesome.
Yeah, also, I have a quick follow-up on that, Jermaine. Do you
Yeah.
see some shifts for the like aspiring professionals? Maybe we talked a lot about like cybersecurity leadership, upskilling people who are already in the industry. What trainings that they can have, maybe micro trainings, micro certifications, or some modules. But in terms of, for example, degrees, do you have any thoughts on that? Like for someone who's in like high school right now and wants to be a
I
cybersecurity
see.
professional, like how does that impact all
So if
that?
I'm tracking, you're asking, are there resources there
No, no, I mean,
for people who are, say, in high school?
no, I mean, I'm just saying, like, how do you think that impacts that decision-making process the things that we talked about? Like, how should people think about planning their career, maybe, in terms of like their education that they want to get, and
Mhm.
then they like maybe professional associations while they're a student.
Mhm. Yeah, they from a decision-making process, right?
Yeah.
And I had some recent conversations with some young professionals and some folks who are about to leave college.
Mm.
And one of the first things that I mentioned to them was find a mentor,
Yeah, that's a good one.
right? Someone that's in the industry already that can point you, that can help guide you along that way to help you with some of these decisions you need to make. Ultimately, it's your decision, but at least you'll have some insights to make an informed decision. The other part is align yourself with organizations, associations like ISACA Greater Washington, D.C., like ISC Squared, like ISA rather, and others that are out there. And then I tap into those resources that I mentioned earlier that you can go in. They're free resources. And we know there's a ton of free resources out there, right? And so I've always been like this. There's not enough bodies to fill the number of open cybersecurity jobs right now. So the challenge is companies need the best of the best right now because of the always rapidly changing landscape. I think the organizations, this is going to help with that decision-making process. If you get those mentors, the sponsors, get those certifications, get some real world experience under your belt, you can come into an organization working. On the flip side, if I were someone trying to make some decisions, look for those organizations that have some kind of internship program that supports you coming in and learning the ropes as you go, and then, incubating you, so to speak. And then once you are ready, you're off and running. That's a challenge. I think that's also an opportunity as well.
All right,
If that
Jermaine.
helps.
Hey, look, we are out of time. We want to thank you for
Okay.
joining us today and sharing your insights on cybersecurity leadership and strategic growth.
Thanks for having me, Jim. It was a pleasure. Always is.
Absolutely, absolutely. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to the Cyber Insights and ISACA-GWDC radio show / podcast. You can check out the chapter's website at www.isaca-gwdc.org. Be sure to subscribe to us and join us at our next time when we continue exploring cybersecurity, IT audit, risk management, and governance. Until then, stay safe.